So good day everyone, I'm Marian M, Tinia, and I'm going to continue the discussion of the following chapters of this book. So the next chapter, we have here the savage male. Savage male looks at why men can be aggressive and violent in different cultures. It studies how society shapes male behavior like warfare and dominance. So Harris uses anthropology to figure out why men act aggressively in various cultures and times. This can be seen actually on Napoleon Chagnon studies. Napoleon Chagnon is a prominent anthropologist known for his studies on the Yanomamo tribe. So Yanomamo tribe is an indigenous group resides in the Amazon rainforest along the border of Brazil and Venezuela. They attracted attention for their unique cultural practices and social structure. And Chagnon's research suggests that the Yanomamo people are notably aggressive and warlike, especially among males. They often bear scars, and Chagnon found that Yanomamo men consider scars from battles and duels as symbols of maturity and strength. Essentially, these scars are seen as their badges of honor within their society. And Yanomamo women may also have scars, but it's because the violence of males in their community. So imagine a society where violence and conflict are not just occasional occurrences but deeply ingrained aspects of daily life. So in Chagnon's study, it revealed how marriage works in Yanomamo society, and it is essentially a contract between two men who agree to exchange sisters, and this exchange creates a close relationship between brother-in-law between them. So, mas katunayan nga, mas may good relationship pa yung mag-brother-in-law kaysa dun sa mga kapatid nilang babae. And they are often engaging in shared activities such as inhaling hallucinogenic powder together while sitting in hammocks. It's the dominant role of males within Yanomamo society where only men are permitted to consume drugs. And they believe kasi that it relieve pain and it communicate them with invisible demons. And sabi nila, sa text, madalas din nila itong i-consume kapag meron silang warfare or raid. And they also hold superstitious beliefs, including the notion that their ancestors were formed from the blood of the moon. And they view menstrual blood as evil to the point na parang kinukulong nila yung mga babae sa society nila and dinedeprive nila sa pagkain. Like, hindi nila pinapakain hanggat may menstruation yung mga babae. And in Chagnon's field study, it paints a vivid picture of the Yanomamo engaging in everything from duels to full-blown warfare. So, bakit kaya? Well, a big part of it boils down to competition over women. Kasi it's because there's a scarcity or shortage of females compared to males in their society. So, men fiercely compete for access to women, leading to aggression and violence. So, in Yanomamo society, parang ma-view natin dito yung mga babae as kawawa. Kasi they often receive multiple violence from their husbands, like their husbands beat them with firewood, swinging axes at them, and hitting them with big and heavy knives. And sa perspective din kasi ng mga husband or ng mga male sa Yanomamo society, their violence symbolizes as them being superior, them being as brave, and it symbolizes their dominance. So, Yanomamo has also been studied by a woman, Professor Judith Shapiro of the University of Chicago, and she focuses on women's perspective. She emphasizes the essentially passive role of Yanomamo women. So, kaya pala parang hinahayaan din ng mga Yanomamo women yung pagtrato sa kanila ng mga husbands nila because Yanomamo women internalize and normalize violence, associating it with care from their husbands, with the belief that increased beatings indicate love. But here's where it gets really interesting for me, because despite appearing passive, and Yanomamo women actually play crucial roles in perpetuating this conflict. They might seem like victims, but they actively participate in practices like infanticide, which is yung parang abortion or pagpatay sa mga babies nila na babae. Yung tinatawag ditong female infanticide. And fini-favor kasi nila dito yung male offspring, which further fuels the competition among men. So, parang kulang na nga sila sa babae, which is yung reason din ng warfare ng mga Yanomamo men is kulang sila sa women in their society, but they are still practicing the female infanticide. And what's one of the main objectives of warfare for the Yanomamo? It's capturing women from enemy villages. And this brutal treatment of female captives only adds to the cycle of violence na naman. But it's not just about women pala. Hindi lang dahil sa women. It's also because of resource scarcity. Yung kakulangan nila sa mga resources, especially when it comes to protein sources. So, this conflict among Yanomamo tribes, and it is not enough. So, the transition from nomadic to agricultural practices has also influenced to this conflict. So, when we say nomadic pala, in the context of the Yanomamo culture, nomadic refers to lifestyle where people move frequently from one place to another. Palipat-lipat sila. And often in search of resources such as food, water, or shelter. So, for the Yanomamo tribe, their historical nomadic lifestyle means they didn't settle in one permanent location, but instead moved around their environment, adapting to changing conditions and exploiting different resources as needed. So this nomadic lifestyle of them has had a significant influence on their culture practices. So when you look at the Yanomamo as a whole, you see a society deeply shaped by historical context, cultural practices, and gender dynamics, all of which perpetuate these cycles of violence and conflict. So, cultural materialism is what I chose to apply in this chapter, the savage male. So, think of the infrastructure as the basic stuff that keeps a society going. For the Yanomamo, it's all about survival in the dense Amazon rainforest. So they're always struggling with finding enough protein sources like meat and fish to eat, plus their settlement patterns and how they get their food are heavily influenced by the environment they live in. So now, when we talk about structure, we're diving into how their society is organized. It's all about who's in charge and who does what. For the Yanomamo, kinship ties and alliances are a big deal. They determine who's on top and who's not. And when it comes to jobs, men handle the hunting and fighting while women take care of the domestic practices. So, this is where things get interesting. Superstructure is all about the beliefs, rituals, and stories that shape how people behave. For the Yanomamo, their cultural beliefs about gender roles and relationships are a big deal. They have rituals like those hallucinogenic ceremonies among men that strengthen their social bonds. But there are also some pretty intense ideologies that justify violence, especially in male-female relationships. And don't forget the myths they believe in, like demons causing trouble during menstruation. That stuff influences how they see the world and interact with each other. So when you put it all together, you we can see here how their material conditions, social organization, and cultural beliefs all interact to shape life in the Yanomamo tribe. So this sums up the idea that all these different aspects like their environment, how they're organized socially, and what they believe work together to create the way of life for the Yanomamo. It's like a big puzzle where each piece affects the others, shaping everything from how they hunt to how they resolve conflicts. So understanding how these pieces fit together helps us grasp why things are the way they are in their society. So our next chapter is the Potlach. So you know how sometimes people are driven not just by basic needs like food or shelter, but also by this intense desire for prestige and status. It's like this craving to be admired and respected by others, almost to the point of obsession, and this competitive streak can lead to some pretty wild behavior where people are willing to do whatever it takes to climb that social ladder. Take Americans for example. So Vance Packard noticed this trend where it seems like everyone is in this constant race to show off their status. People devote their lives to impressing others, trying to one-up each other in the social hierarchy. And then there's Thorstein Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption and conspicuous waste. It's all about flaunting your wealth in extravagant ways, spending lavishly, and even being wasteful just to keep up with what society expects. But let's circle back to the potlatch tradition among Native American tribes on the coast. This takes the whole status game to a whole new level, where individuals going all out to show off their wealth and power by giving away or even destroying their possessions. Some would go as far as burning down their own houses just to prove a point and gain admiration from others. It's like a grand display of dominance and prestige rooted in this ancient tradition of showcasing wealth and power. So in this text, there are these two, the Kwakitul tribe and the big man practicing the potlatch. So Ruth Benedict, in her Patterns of Culture, introduced the concept of potlatch among the Kwakitul people in her book. So she saw potlatch as this sort of over-the-top display where chiefs would give away tons of gifts and basically brag about how great they were. For them, it was all about being seen as at the top, the most respected leader in the community, and Benedict thought it was all about this hunger for status and respect, this drive to be the best. But then along comes Marvin Harris, who had a different take. He said, it's not just about wanting to be the coolest chief or at the top. For him, potlatch was more about how resources were shared and how communities stayed together. So it was practical, not just about showing off. So now let's zoom in on what actually happened during these potlatch ceremonies. So chiefs would go all out, gathering up important stuff like fish and berries to impress their guests, and when the big day arrived, it was a feast for everyone. With delicious food and entertainment, it was time for the whole community to come together, strengthen bonds, and just have a good time. But here's the interesting part. Potlatch wasn't just about partying. It was also a way for chiefs to manage resources and keep the social order in check. By giving away all these gifts, they were redistributing wealth and showing who was in charge. It was like a high stakes game of status where the winner got to call the shots in the community. So when we look at potlatch, we see this mix of celebration, competition, and practicality all coming together to shape the Kwakitul society in some pretty unique ways. Okay, so now there is this second group of individual who's practicing potlatch also, which is the big men. So these were influential folks, the big men, like Atana from the Kawoka speaking community, who knew how to throw a party, but these weren't your average get-togethers. They were big, fancy feasts meant to show off and boost their status in the community. So, these big men were all about impressing others and proving how wealthy, generous, and connected they were. So, they'd go all out, rallying their family and friends to help gather food, like planting bigger gardens or catching more fish, and of course, they'd invite guests who'd bring even more goods to add to the feast. It was all about making a splash and strengthening those social ties. And it worked like a charm. These feasts weren't just about stuffing your face. They were about showing everyone just how important you were by giving out food, gifts, and all sorts of valuable stuff during the feast. So these big men were basically saying, hey, look at me, I'm the one taking care of everyone here. And you can bet people took notice, which only boosted the big man's reputation and status even more. But however, being a big man wasn't like walking in the park. You had to constantly be planning and hosting bigger and better feasts to stay on the top, to stay on your position. So your reputation and status were always on the line with every party you threw. For someone like Atana, that meant pouring a lot of time and money into making sure his feasts were the talk of the town. So now let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. These feasts weren't just about showing off. They served some important functions within their communities, as Marvin Harris views. They helped spread out resources more evenly, brought people together, and strengthened those social bonds. So, while it might seem like all fun and games, there was actually a lot riding on these feasts for the big men and their communities. And when we compare this to what we talked about with the Quackatoo chiefs, we can see some similarities and differences. Both groups were using these big gatherings as a way to assert their status and distribute resources, but they had their own unique ways of doing it. So, let's talk about the significance of competitive feasting in terms of status and how it ties into an evolutionary perspective. So when we talk about leaders like Atana or the Quackatoo chiefs, we're looking at a concept called redistribution. So now, what exactly is redistribution? Well, it's pretty straightforward. It's all about collecting and then spreading the wealth among different groups. So when these leaders throw these big feasts, it's not just about having a good time and showing off. It's a strategic move rooted in evolutionary principles by gathering resources and then sharing them out. They're not only demonstrating their power and generosity, but also ensuring social cohesion and stability within their communities. It's like they're saying, hey, I've got plenty to go around, and I'm taking care of my people. So think of the Quackatoo chiefs as the top in a hierarchy. They weren't out there doing the grunt work like the regular folks. Instead, they were the ones calling it, planning the big potlatch ceremony, and making sure everything ran smoothly. It was like they were the CEOs of the community, and they even had a slaves to do it for them. And now, when it came to sharing stuff during these potlatch ceremonies, the Quackatoo chiefs definitely had the upper hand. They got first on all the best goods, while the rest of the community got whatever was left over. So this unequal distribution of resources wasn't just about who got the nicest. It was a symbol of the chief's power and authority. It was their way of saying, I'm in charge here. And get this, some chiefs even had slaves to do the work for them. And that's right, they had other people doing all the heavy lifting while they sat back and enjoyed the finer things in life, talk about having it made. But it wasn't just about flaunting their wealth and power. Quackatoo chiefs also had some pretty impressive totem poles, they call it totem poles, to show off. These poles, carved with intricate designs, were like status symbols, reminding everyone of the chief's importance and heritage. It was their way of saying, I come from a long line of important people, and I've got the goods to prove it. So, when we look at how redistribution worked among the Quackatoo chiefs, it's not just about who gets what, it's about reinforcing social hierarchies and showing off that they are on top, that their top status. So, now let's move to how redistribution worked among the big men. So, like Atana among the Kawako-speaking people in Melanesia, unlike the Quackatoo chiefs we talked about earlier, these big men weren't just sitting back and calling it. So they were rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty. They put in the hard work, whether it was farming, fishing, or raising pigs, all to build up their wealth within the community, unlike the Quackatoo chiefs. So by working tirelessly and accumulating surplus goods, these big men positioned themselves as key players who could meet the needs of the community. They weren't just doing it for themselves either. They took on the role of redistributors, making sure that everyone got their fair share. Unlike the chiefs who tended to keep the best stuff for themselves, these big men were all about equality. They shared everything they had equally among everyone in the community, showing that they cared about the well-being of others than their own personal gain. Kasi for them, prestige was the ultimate reward. So sa katunayan pa nga, parang minsan parang buto-buto na lang yung natitira sa kanila. And mas pinibigyan nila ng malaking portion yung mga tao sa society nila. So yun nga, for example, Atana, he'd put in the sweat and tears to grow yams, gather coconuts, and raise pigs. And when it came to divide up the goods, he made sure that everyone got a piece of it. And there was hardly anything left for him because he believed in sharing the wealth for the greater good. So yun nga. Unlike sa Quackatoo chief, big men like Atana, nag-i-engage talaga sila sa work. So the status and respect that these big men enjoyed were all thanks to their ability to mobilize resources and redistribute them fairly within the community. Unlike the Quackatoo chiefs, whose status was tied to their flashy displays of wealth and power, these big men earned admiration through their hard work, leadership, and generosity. So when we compare the redistribution practices of Quackatoo chiefs and the big men, it's clear that they had different styles. While the chiefs relied on their inherited status and kept the best for themselves, the big men earned their respect through their sweat equity and commitment to equality. So next, we have here the reciprocity in egalitarian society. So imagine you're living in a powerful society where rulers flaunt their wealth and power by building grand palaces and monuments, asserting their dominance through force. Here, there is no need for elaborate feasts or ceremonies to prove one's status. It's all about might and power. But in more equal societies or in egalitarian societies, boasting and showing off can land you in hot water. Think about it, if everyone is on a relatively level playing field, there's less need to flaunt your wealth or status. In fact, in truly equal societies, excessive boasting might even get you accused of witchcraft and facing serious consequences. Now, let's talk about the reciprocity. In egalitarian societies, people don't engage in big feasts to compete with each other. Instead, they practice reciprocity, which is a way of sharing without strict rules or timelines. It's like giving and getting things without expecting an immediate return. So, in these societies, reciprocity is crucial for maintaining harmony and cooperation among community members. In a fair society, reciprocity means sharing without keeping strict tabs on who owes what. It's about helping each other out without expecting something in return right away. But if someone consistently fails to share or violates the rules of reciprocity, they view it as a red flag. They might be seen as a threat to the community's well-being. But now, in truly egalitarian societies where there's no money, they have no money or buying and selling, reciprocity takes on an even deeper meaning. It's not about keeping score or expecting something in return. It's about freely giving and receiving without any strings attached. So, in these societies, expressing gratitude for received goods or services can actually be considered impolite or rude. It's because it might imply that they view it as it might imply that you're keeping track or expecting something in return, which goes against the spirit of reciprocity. So, for example, the Semi people in Central Malaya don't say thank you when given meat because it or gifts because it could seem like they're calculating or surprised. So they value humility and sharing without any expectation of special treatment. So reciprocity here serves as a vital mechanism for wealth redistribution among non-ruling classes in egalitarian societies. It ensures that resources are shared fairly among community members, preventing the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Unlike sa redistribution practices ng Quackatol chiefs and big men na diniscuss natin kanina. So next is the schemos. The schemos had a saying, gifts make slaves just as whips make dogs. So meaning they were wary of generous gift givers because for them, too many gifts could create a sense of obligation and control, almost like being enslaved. When people received gifts, they often felt compelled to reciprocate, creating a cycle where the gift givers gained power and influence. And eventually, these powerful individuals didn't need to play by the rules anymore. They could force others to work for them without offering anything in return. Even today, leaders understand that it's easier to motivate people by occasionally rewarding them rather than always being harsh. Now, let's delve into why some cultures allow this power dynamic to emerge. So, in societies where giving and receiving gifts created a sense of obligation, the cycle of reciprocity could spiral out of control. Those who gave the most gifts often gained power and influence, leading to skewed balance of power. And people in this society might not have realized the risks involved, or they simply didn't know how to stop this imbalance from occurring. But why did competitive status seeking lead to inequality in some societies? Well, imagine a scenario where people started competing for status by producing more goods or working harder. Like yung kaninang discussion na about sa Quackatoo chiefs and big men. So, this shift from exchanging favors to competing for status could lead to inequality because those who could produce more goods gained more power and prestige. This transformation often occurred when societies transitioned from relying on nature like hunting and gathering to more intensive agricultural practices. So in essence, these dynamics show how the pursuit of status and the exchange of gifts can influence power dynamics and lead to inequality in societies. So, back in the day, people used to exchange gifts as a way to strengthen relationships and keep social harmony in check. This system, known as reciprocity, meant that when someone gave a gift, they expected something in return, creating a balance. But as societies evolved and people started vying for status, things shifted. Instead of focusing on building relationships through gift giving, folks began hustling harder to amass wealth and resources in order to climb that social ladder. Now, this switch up in behavior completely transformed how societies operated. Suddenly, those who could rack up more wealth and resources ended up wielding more power and influence. And you guessed it, this led to power becoming concentrated in the hands of a select few, which caused some serious imbalances and inequality in society. So, the move from exchanging gifts out of reciprocity to competing for status drastically changed the way societies function and paving the way for unequal distribution of power and resources. So here, cultural materialism provides a lens through which we can understand the dynamics behind potlatch ceremonies among the Krakatoa and the competitive feasting practices of big men in Melanesia. So let's start with the infrastructure. For Krakatoa, their potlatch ceremonies were deeply influenced by the abundance of resources, particularly salmon, with salmon being plentiful in their environment. The Krakatoa were able to host elaborate ceremonies showcasing their wealth and status through extravagant feasts. On the other hand, Melanesian big men took a labor-intensive approach, engaging in activities like farming and pig rearing to accumulate wealth for their feasts, so reflecting the economic activities prevalent in their societies. Now, moving on to structure, crocodile potlatches were structured around hierarchical relationships, which chiefs using these ceremonies to assert their dominance and authority. Meanwhile, Melanesian big men assumed leadership roles by mobilizing labor and resources from their social networks to organize feasts, positioning themselves as influential figures within their communities. And finally, let's talk about the superstructure. For the Quackatl, potlatches symbolized prestige and power with totem poles, serving as visual representations of chiefly authority. These ceremonies reinforce the hierarchical structure of Quackatl society, where chiefs held positions of privileges and influence. In contrast, feasts in Melanesian societies were symbolic of social cohesion and reciprocity, emphasizing the importance of sharing and mutual support within the community. And I also apply the symbolic anthropology in this chapter, the Potlach. So, symbolic anthropology is an approach within anthropology that focuses on studying symbols and their meanings in cultural practices. It helps us understand how people use symbols to represent and communicate important aspects of their culture, such as beliefs, values, and social relationships. Now, let's apply this to the context of potlatches and feasts. When we look at potlatches among the Quackatl, we see rich symbolism at play. These ceremonies were not just about exchanging gifts, they were symbolic representations of status, prestige, and power dynamics within Quackatl society. Take for example the totem poles during potlatches. These weren't just wooden structures. They were symbolic representations of a chief's authority and lineage, conveying a message about the social hierarchy and the chief's position within it. Similarly, feasts organized by Melanesian big men were also steeped in symbolism. The grandeur of these feasts symbolized concepts like generosity, reciprocity, and community identity. So, by hosting feasts and sharing resources with others, big men conveyed messages about their social status and leadership roles within their communities. Now, let's talk about how these cultural practices represent social relationships. So, in potlatches among the Quackatl, the exchange of gifts and valuable wasn't just about giving and receiving. It symbolizes obligations between chiefs and their followers, as well as relationships between different kinship groups within the community. Likewise, feasts among Melanesian big men also represented social relationships and dynamics within their societies. So, the act of sharing resources during this feast symbolizes obligations and solidarity among community members. It reinforced the social status and leadership role of big men within their communities. And lastly, let's discuss how these practices convey community identity. So, potlatches among the Quackatl were essential for expressing and reinforcing community identity. The participation of community members in potlatches and the exchange of gifts symbolized their belongingness to the community and their shared cultural values and traditions. So, feasts among Melanesian big men served as a similar purpose. The communal nature of these feasts and the participation of community members symbolized their collective identity and the shared sense of belonging to the community. So, to sum it all up, symbolic anthropology helps us understand that potlatches and feasts were more than just events. They were symbolic expressions of status, power, dynamics, social relationships, and community identity within their respective cultures. These cultural practices serve as powerful mediums for conveying and reinforcing important cultural values and beliefs. So moving on to the next chapter, which is the phantom cargo. So, in a remote village nestled in the lush forest of New Guinea, where indigenous people eagerly anticipate the arrival of something extraordinary, it's not your typical delivery truck or mailman they're waiting for. It's cargo planes, believed to be piloted by their ancestors from the spirit world. These planes carry modern treasures like canned food, radios, and motorcycles believed to be brought by supernatural means. Now, this isn't just about getting new gadgets. It's much deeper than that. The arrival of this cargo symbolizes a new era of prosperity and unity between the living and the dead. It's like a bridge connecting two worlds, promising abundance and reunification. So initially, these beliefs were heavily influenced by the presence of Americans in the region. People depicted their ancestors as pilots of cargo planes bringing in all sorts of modern goods from the United States, like canned food, radios, and motorcycles. It was very American-centric, reflecting the cultural context of time. But then, history took its course, especially during and after World War II, with the Australians and Americans gaining control and cutting off the Japanese supply lines. This where the dynamics shifted, and so did the cargo beliefs. Now, instead of just American pilots, indigenous gods started taking center stage in these beliefs. It's like they adapted to the changing times and power dynamics. So, when early European explorers first arrived, the natives saw them as ancestors. Because parang these explorers were bringing gifts, and to the natives, these gifts were like cargo delivered by their ancestors, signaling supernatural power and favor. So it was a very big deal for them. But then along came the missionaries trying to convert the natives to Christianity. Now, unlike the explorers who were handing out tangible rewards like food, the missionaries had a tougher time. They couldn't just give out stuff, and they had to convince the natives to believe in something intangible. So what they did is they took the concept of cargo and put it in a Christian framework. They promised rewards for obedience and conversion, framing cargo as a divine blessing for those who followed Christian teachings. So it kind of made sense without their religious beliefs. But here's the twist. Despite all these promises, the cargo never really showed up for the natives. And you can imagine what happened next. They started getting skeptical. Like, why believe in something that doesn't deliver? So in the end, this whole intersection of cargo beliefs and colonialism paints a complex picture of historical encounters between Europeans and indigenous people. It shows how perceptions can shift and how promises can fall short, leading to skepticism and questioning of missionary teachings. So let's move on to the impact of the Japanese occupation during World War II on the cargo beliefs of the native population in New Guinea and how it shaped their perceptions and interactions with outsiders. So imagine you're a native in New Guinea during World War II. When the Japanese arrived, it seemed like a partial fulfillment of their cargo prophecies. They believed that outsiders, no matter who they were linked to the arrival of anticipated cargo. The Japanese, knowing this, exploited their beliefs to gain cooperation, using their aspirations for supernatural rewards to manipulate and control them. But here's the harsh truth. When the war ended, the promised cargo never came. Instead, the Japanese occupation brought suffering and atrocities. So it shattered the natives' faith in the cargo beliefs and the promises made by outsiders. Now, fast forward to the post-war period. The Australian come in with promises of development and prosperity. They assure them of a better future with improved living conditions and economic opportunities. But after everything they've been through, they're skeptical. They've seen promises broken before, and they're not sure if they can give trust in them this time. Then there's Yali. Yali is a native leader who has a revelation during a visit to Australia. So he sees the stark contrast between the advanced infrastructure and prosperity enjoyed by the Europeans and the impoverished state of his own people back in New Guinea. So this realizations deepens this skepticism and fuels this delusionment with the missionary narratives. He starts questioning the underlying principles of cargo beliefs and the unequal distribution of wealth and resources. So in summary, World War II and its aftermath had a profound impact on cargo beliefs among the native population of New Guinea. So the Japanese occupation shattered illusions of supernatural rewards, while post-war promises failed to fully restore faith, and Yali's personal revelation highlighted the harsh realities faced by the indigenous population, sparking further skepticism and questioning of eternal narratives. So, Yali's response to the colonial landscape is really something. He's got this mix of pragmatism, skepticism, and resilience That's pretty fascinating to watch. Like in the scene or in the part, Yali's checking out the Queensland Museum and he's seeing all these exhibits that challenge everything he's been taught about the world and colonial influence. Like there's stuff about human evolution that contradicts what the missionaries have been telling, and it's like a light bulb moment for him. He starts questioning the authenticity of Christian teachings and the motives behind missionary efforts to convert indigenous peoples. But it's not just about the evolution stuff. Yal is also confronted with his own culture artifacts behind glass being worshipped by these visitors in their frocks. And it's a wake-up call for him, making him realize how colonial powers have appropriated and preserved indigenous culture for their own purposes. So what does Yali do? He reinterprets the whole museum as a symbol of Rome, where colonial powers control the secret of cargo. Basically, he sees it as a tool of oppression, and instead of just sitting back, he starts advocating for a return to indigenous beliefs and practices, and it challenged the dominance of Christianity and the collaborating with colonial authorities in a strategic way. So despite the government's efforts to clamp down on cargo activities and keep control over the native population, they're starting to sense this growing defiance and resistance. They see it as a threat to their power and control over the colony. Now, let's get into the legal side of things. Yali becomes this big target for the government. They arrest him and throw him on trial, accusing him of incitement to rape and deprivation of liberty. It's like they're trying to show who's boss and squash any challenges up to their authority. So Yali ends up getting convicted and slapped with a 6-year sentence. It's a clear message from the government. They won't tolerate anyone messing with their rules. Pero kahit nakulong si Yali, his followers aren't giving up. They're still holding out hope for his return, believing he'll lead them to a better future. So it's a sign of their resilience and their refusal to give up into colonial oppression. So what we're seeing here is this intense clash between the colonial authorities and the native population. The government is trying hard to keep control, but the natives aren't backing down. It's a tense situation, but it's also a testament to the strength of native resistance against colonial oppression. So fast forward, nung nakalaya na si Yali, but even after he's out of jail na, Yali stays pretty active in standing up for his beliefs and keeping his influence strong among his followers. He even tries to get elected to the Madang Council, showing he's not backing down from the political scene. And get this, even in his old age, or in that age, people still look up to him. They're giving him gifts and paying him to perform ceremonies that kind of go against Christianity, showing they're ready to embrace their old ways. But Yali doesn't stop there. He makes this bold prediction about New Guinea's independence, setting a specific date for it, and even appointing ambassadors to key nations. It's like he's laying the groundwork for a big change. So now let's zoom out a bit. The text wraps up by looking at cargo beliefs in a broader historical context. It challenges the idea that native beliefs are just backward or superstitious, pointing out how Yali rejects European explanations for why some people have all the wealth while others struggles. Instead, Phantom Cargo suggests that cargo beliefs are really about demanding fair treatment and a share of the wealth that's been taken from them. It's like a way of saying, hey, we deserve better, and we're not gonna just sit back and take it. So, at its core, cargo beliefs are a form of resistance against colonial exploitation. They're all about fighting for social and economic justice in the face of centuries of colonial rule. Yale's story shows us that even in the toughest of times, people will keep fighting for what they believe in and demanding a fair shake. It's a powerful message about resilience and standing up against justice. Let's talk about how the cultural materialism theory fits into the phantom cargo. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're looking at the material conditions of the indigenous New Guineans. They're eagerly awaiting for these cargo planes, thinking their ancestors are flying them in with all these modern goods like canned food and radios. But why are they so eager? It all comes down to their everyday lives. They're dealing with scarcity and not having easy access to modern stuff. So they're longing for these items that could make them lives easier. So in structure, within these communities, leaders start popping up. And it's all based on who's seen as having this special connection to the supernatural wealth tied to the cargo. So these leaders get their influence by promising their followers access to and a piece of this anticipated cargo. So it's like a power play where the promise of access to material wealth boosts their status and control. And finally, for the superstructure, here's where it gets really interesting is the cargo cult beliefs aren't just about waiting for planes to drop off goods. They're a whole form of religious expression and resistance against colonial control. So these beliefs shape how the indigenous people see the world and what they hope for. It's like they're interpreting their encounters with colonizers through this lens of cargo beliefs, using it to push back and against the exploitation they're facing. So when we put it all together, to sum it all up, we see how the cultural materialism theory helps us understand what's going on in phantom cargo. It's not just about waiting for planes, it's about how the material conditions, social structures, and cultural beliefs all sum together in this complex of resistance and hope against colonial domination. So let's move on to the next chapter, the Messiahs. So when we look at the resemblances between phantom cargo and messiahs, we see that both Jesus of Nazareth and Yali, the central figure in cargo cults, were all about prophesying justice for the poor, the downfall of the wicked, and the end of the suffering. They both talked about establishing a divine kingdom, and this idea of a better world where everything's just and righteous. It's like they share this vision of a brighter future brought about by divine power. And these similarities make us wonder if understanding cargo cults can actually help us get a better grasp on where religious beliefs come from in general. It's like maybe there's something deeper going on here, something about human nature or the societies we live in that leads to these kinds of beliefs. But of course, there are differences too. Cargo cults were all about shaking up the political order, aiming to establish a kingdom right here on earth, and they even expected their ancestors to come back as soldiers. But of course, there are differences too. Cargo cults were all about shaking up the political order, aiming to establish a kingdom right here on earth, and they even expected their ancestors to come back as soldiers to help out. It's very important about tangible changes in the material world. On the other hand, Jesus' teachings were more about spiritual stuff like finding inner peace and salvation, not so much about overthrowing governments. And while cargo cults were all about getting material goods early, Christianity focused more on spiritual fulfillment and the promise of a heavenly kingdom in the afterlife. So even though there are some similarities in their visions of justice and divine intervention, there are also some big differences in what they were aiming for and what they expected to happen. Understanding these distinctions can give us a deeper insight. So let's talk about the Christianity's roots in Jewish messianic beliefs. So when we look at Christianity, we can't ignore its deep ties to ancient Judaism. The whole idea of a Messiah, someone chosen by God to bring about justice and salvation, and it actually predates Christianity. So in Judaism, the term Messiah originally referred to individuals who were seen as embodying holiness and power, kind of like King David. Now, King David's story is pretty key here. He started as this shepherd boy, but then he rose to become this powerful king. And that journey from humble beginnings to greatness served as a big inspiration for what people thought the ideal messianic career should look like. So Jewish priests even thought that God had his special covenant with David, promising that his dynasty would last forever. So you can imagine, with all this talk about a future messianic figure descending from David, there was this expectation among Jewish people of justice being brought. And this is where Christianity steps in. It builds upon this foundation of Jewish messianic beliefs. They claim that Jesus of Nazareth was the fulfillment of those ancient prophecies. So, in a way, Christianity is like this. Parang continuation siya ng Jewish tradition, but with its own unique twists and interpretations. So, it's this blend of community with Jewish teachings and new theological ideas introduced by Jesus and his followers that shapes Christianity into what it is today. So, with its emphasis on salvation, redemption, and the promise of an eternal kingdom. So, and now, let's dive into the struggles faced under Roman rule in Palestine. So, it's in the first century, and Palestine is under the thumb of Romans. Now, Herod the Great, he's this guy appointed by the Romans to rule over Palestine, or they call him the puppet king. But he's got his work cut out for him because he's dealing with all these bandits causing chaos and trying to consolidate control over the region. But then when Herod kicks the bucket, things really start to hit the fan. People are fed up with Roman rule and they're not afraid to show it. Rebellions start popping up all over the place, led by folks like Judas of Galilee and Atrugius. These rebels are saying, enough is enough. They're challenging Roman authority, standing up against the oppression they've been facing. So these events paint a pretty clear picture of just how unhappy the people of Palestine were with the Roman government at the time. So, it's like a reminder that even under the might of the Roman Empire, there were still those who dared to resist and fight for their freedom. So next is Judas of Galilee and his fight against the Romans back in ancient times. So Judas is this guy who steps up as a leader of guerrilla forces, dreaming of the aim of royalty and standing up against the Roman rule. When the Romans wanted to do a census in 6 AD, Judas was like, no way. He believed in Jewish sovereignty and wasn't about to let the Romans dictate how things were gonna go down in his homeland. So he saw himself as this champion of his people's freedom, warning against Roman taxation and asserting that only God should be their true leader. His sons kept the flame burning, and so his sons continue his work. One of them even claimed to be chosen by God, or like the Messiah, they call it Messiah. During this big revolt from 68 to 73 AD, their resistance was fierce, especially when they made their last stand at Masada. Instead of surrendering to the Romans, they chose to fight to the very end, to the bitter end, showing just how determined they were to keep up the fight for their land and their people. So when we look at Judas and his followers, we see this fierce determination to resist Roman domination and fight for their beliefs. So it's a powerful reminder of the lengths people will go to when they feel their freedom and way of life are threatened. Next is Jesus and the rebellions happening around him. So it's around 28 AD, and Jesus is out there preaching his message in the midst of all these uprisings going on in places like Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem. Now, Jesus' teachings were definitely making waves, but in the grand scheme of things, they weren't that the biggest or most threatening rebellions that Pilate, the Roman governor, had to deal with. So there were all sorts of things stirring up trouble in the region, like there were protests against making graven images, idols and stuff, and folks were arguing about how temple funds were being used. It was a pretty tense atmosphere with people feeling restless and ready to push back against the power that be. So when we think about it, Jesus and the context of rebellion, it's important to remember that he was just one piece of the puzzle. His teachings were significant for sure, but they were part of this larger unrest and resistance brewing in ancient Palestine. So now, when Jesus died and how the resistance kept going strong. So even after Jesus was gone, the Romans weren't about to let up on their efforts to squash any hint of rebellion. Leaders like Ptolemaeus and Theudas stepped up, they organized resistance movements against Roman rule, but unfortunately their efforts didn't end well because they were captured and met violent ends, probably through execution. And it wasn't just these leaders. During Passover and other times, there were disturbances and revolts popping up all over the places, led by figures like Eleazar, Denaios, and these events only added fuel to the fire, making the tensions between the Jewish population and the Roman authorities even worse. So even though Jesus was no longer around, the fight for freedom and justice in ancient Palestine didn't stop. It just kept going, with new leaders stepping up and new movements emerging, all pushing back against the might of the Roman Empire. So during this turbulent period, violence was really on the rise. We're talking about the assassinations left and right, religious scams, and banditry become pretty much over everyday occurrences. So then in 52 AD, there's this big revolt led by Eleazar. It spreads like wildfire, but as you might expect, the Romans weren't having it and they hit back hard. Now, onto Menahem's story. He's got some serious guts, storming Masada and leading a rebellion in Jerusalem. At first, things seem to be going his way, but it doesn't last long. So the Romans come down on him and his rebellion is squashed. So what we're seeing here is just how intense the resistance against Roman rule was back then. So as the resistance kept on boiling over, the Romans decided they had enough. Generals like Vespasian and Titus were leading the charge to regain control. They surrounded Jerusalem and went all in with the siege 70 AD. It was brutal. The temple, the heart of Jewish life, got razed to the ground, and the casualties were staggering. Now, what really hits home about this whole mess is what Josephus as Now, what really hits home about this whole mess is what Josephus, a historian of the time, had to say. So, he delved into the messianic prophecies swirling around and just how devastating the whole conflict was for everyone involved. It's a grim reminder of the price of rebellion and the might of the Roman war machine. So after the dust settled from the Roman siege of Jerusalem, things took a drastic turn. So the fall of Masada was a turning point, marking the end of Jewish military resistance against Roman rule. But despite a few more attempts like Bar Kokhba's revolt, they all ended up in failure, leaving behind a trail of destruction. But here's the thing, this rebellion wasn't just about some messianic fervor. It was a response to the injustice of Roman colonialism. Believing in a powerful, vengeful Messiah wasn't just a matter of faith. It was a practical way to resist Roman authority and challenge their perception of invincibility. So it's a reminder that history isn't just about battles and conquests. It's about the people and the ideas that shape them. So here's something intriguing. Amidst all the chaos of rebellion, there's this emergence of a peaceful Messiah. Now that's a head scratcher. I mean, why would such a figure pop up when things are still so turbulent? So it really makes you think about the connection between religious beliefs and the everyday challenges people were grappling with. Maybe there's more to it than meets the eye. Perhaps it's a sign of how spirituality and the harsh realities of the rebellion were intertwined, shaping the emergence of this peaceful Messiah figure. And it's a reminder that history is full of surprises and complexities that keep us scratching our heads. So, in ancient Palestine, people believed in a special leader called a Messiah, who they thought would save them from their problems, because the government was always changing and the Romans were in charge. There were a lot of conflicts and fights, and these fights caused big changes in how society worked and made life difficult for everyone. The mix of religion, politics, and society was really complicated and made things hard for the people living there. So what's the biggest lesson here? Well, when we dig into history, especially stuff like religious movements and political unrest, we gotta remember it's like a big tangled web. Everything's connected, and to really get what was going on, we need to look at things from all angles. Take Judas of Galilee, for example. This guy led a rebellion against the Romans because he was all about Jewish independence and wasn't having any of their taxes. So his story is a perfect example of how religion and politics were like peanut butter and jelly back then. His whole deal was rooted in this idea of Jewish sovereignty driven by the belief that only God should be their ruler, not some Roman, not some like Roman. And it wasn't just about politics, it was about sticking to deeply held religious beliefs about who they were as a people. So I also apply the cultural materialism theory in this chapter, the Messiah. So in this infrastructure, like back in ancient Palestine, it was all about dealing with tough times, you know, economic struggles, being under Roman rule, and facing environmental issues. All of this created this kind of pressure situation where people were looking for some sort of hope or empowerment. Then comes the structure, which is more about the social side of things, the institutions and relationships that spring up from those tough conditions. So you've got these charismatic leaders stepping up, organizing events, and bringing folks together to resist Roman rule. So they're like rallying point for people who want change. So lastly, the superstructure is all about it's like this. People start believing in these messianic figures who will save them from their struggles, and symbols like the temples in Jerusalem become really important in reinforcing those beliefs. So everything kind of ties together, the economic struggles, the social movements. So this whole idea of cultural materialism helps us to see how all these different factors, economic, social, and cultural, all come together to shape these messianic movements and why they were so significant back then. It's like zooming out and seeing the big picture behind what was going on in ancient Palestine. So that's all for this part.